think architecture matters because it shapes the places and spaces that we live in. At its best, it can inspire, it can elevate the human experience. It can bring people together, communities together. It requires a great deal of thought because we're also saying something about our culture and our place every time we create a piece of architecture. And, you know, it's something as a history buff. When I look at architecture over the ages, it always tells me something about the people that built it and what their values were as a community and what they valued as people. And it matters to me a lot because I got into architecture as someone who wanted to be an artist and loves beauty and loves aesthetics. But I've grown to understand over time that it also has a bigger purpose, which is to keep communities safe, to provide a decent and dignified way of living for people, and to take care of those that may not have the money to commission the architect, but have to live with the impacts of what those architects decide. So it has a much bigger purpose than just doing a beautiful building, an award-winning building. It has to do with really shaping the pattern on the land with the resources that are given to you that's going to last far longer than we're around to enjoy it. What is it going to be, 50, 100 years from now? What's it going to be even in the lifespan of my children, of the kids that I teach or the architects that I'm mentoring? So I don't think that's something that the previous generations had to grapple with as much before, is are we even going to have this community in the future, especially if you're a coastal architect? That's something that's front and center more and more. Not just as a hubristic, is my building going to survive 50 years from now? Is it going to be underwater? But does this community have a chance? Does it have a shot? Are we building in a way that is mindful of what's coming, or are we burying our heads in the sand? I don't believe there's ever been a time where it's been more important to grapple with what's happening in the environment, because we have the knowledge that other generations didn't have before. We have the science. And in the view of that, knowing what the science is telling us, it's no longer enough for a building to be beautiful or to have, great features or to do the job in the present day. You really need to think of, as architects, what's going to happen and how do we design buildings that can last and can flex and can adapt to what's coming. And that's something that's taking more and more of my time in my spare time as an architect in the community. When I volunteer or when I'm given the microphone to talk about design, very often I drift into talking about resiliency and sustainability for that reason. How do we design buildings that can flex, and how do we protect our coastal communities in the future? I've been on a lot of panels with architects from a lot of islands in the Caribbean or other places up and down the coast in Florida that have far less resources, and they're all looking at us as for answers and for solutions about how and where we should build. So I think that is definitely one of the new challenges, and it's going to be with us for decades to come. And I think it's part of the new brief of architecture, is how do we marry sustainability and resiliency into the buildings that we're designing, and how do we protect the communities of the future to have a shot on living on this planet? Well, wellness matters. I mean, if you look at the epidemic of mental health issues, of just the loneliness that our society has, we're living more and more in time indoors, siloed off from our fellow man. Those third spaces, those common spaces that we used to share as humans that would bring our communities together, they're falling apart. In my lifetime, I've seen the mall go from being a central hub where people would go and see each other, and you get different peoples of different incomes and backgrounds kind of commingling, to an era where people are building silos and living away from each other. And so whether it's the urban design aspect of wellness, or a connection to nature and natural spaces, or just whether or not you design a space that has dignity and during an epidemic has an outside area that you can go to and get away from, illness or from people that are struggling with all sorts of issues that, absolutely wellness is central, because we're designing for humans and we're designing for people to have healthy and happy lives in the buildings that we design. So it's central to the brief as well. And as I mentioned, climate change and the science is telling us the world is heating up. So we can't design business as usual and hope that we have a better outcome. I think the brief has never been more challenging to do beautifully designed buildings that can function and flex over time, and that can help people live dignified, healthy, happy lives inside of them. Yeah, I think wellness is absolutely critical. I just finished presenting a project to a developer, and instead of creating a list of resiliency and sustainability features that quickly can get edited on the cutting room floor at the end, I lead with that. So when we're talking about, when they say to me, I'd like to do a resilient design, as an architect, if you really study it and if you understand what that means, then you can offer what are the biggest, most important things that you need to do and have the data and the science to back it up. So for a project that we're doing on Key Biscayne, for example, we talked about the number one thing is elevation. All the science says that the FEMA maps are outdated. And the way that you can talk to your clients in an educated way about it is to use science data. ULI is a really good source of information. I think that, we need to all of us have the data and the science behind us. So when we make those arguments, we can do it in a way that resonates with them. And for them, for example, what I used was insurance rates are going up, and that's something you're going to be seeing tripling in your lifespan if you don't build higher. Your bond rating as a city, when I was talking to the city planner, is also going to be affected by what you do and what you allow in your city. You know that the FEMA maps are outdated because they're politicized, and the new edition of FEMA maps is not coming out. So why would we ever design a building that is supposed to last 50, 100 years when we know that in 4 or 5 years, the codes are going to change, and effectively what we're designing right now is going to be obsolete? Nobody wants to build an obsolete building. Nobody wants to be faced with not being able to get financing or getting insurance. And if that's how the language that you use with your clients, for example, to get them to understand why it's important to build higher, or why it's important to elevate, mechanical systems, or why it's important to, build in a certain way, then those are effective tools. And I think we should share all those tools as architects in our AIA community and our ULI community, so that when the individual architects are asked to be making a case for these kinds of features, you can do it in a way that it's beyond, well, it's because it's good for the planet or because that's a smart way of building. You have data to back it up. And if you have costs associated, well, it's only going to add, 10% of cost for this, but you're going to be able to finance it easier. You're going to be able to pay less insurance. Then you're starting to make a business case proposition for it. And at the end of the day, the people that we're dealing with as our clients are businessmen. So you have to speak to them where they're at. But I think, it's really incumbent upon us to change the code as quickly as we can. So we're not put in that position of having to be salesmen for these things. And until we are, to understand the data and the science so we can do it effectively. There's a new report coming out on coastal resiliency, and they asked me, as my perspective of somebody who's been in the intersection of policy and practice for now 20, 30 years of doing this. And my point is that I think it would be super helpful if we change the code, because as I tell as I say in this essay, I was saying that I graduated after the hurricane of 1992, and it really shaped the building code of Florida for years to come. In the beginning, it was voluntary. If you guys recall, it was, you can put shutters, you could do this, you could do that. And nowadays, it's a mandatory thing. And so when I am in a project meeting with our clients, we don't have to explain why we have to build tougher buildings for wind. So we've already kind of cleared that battle. But for water and for rising sea level, we have not. It's still a voluntary situation that's based on outdated FEMA maps. And that's why all of our coastal areas, we really need to kind of make that the code. We need to make elevation the code. We need to make resilient buildings the code, because it should not be forced upon the architect to make that argument every single project, because the reality is we're not winning that fight. If I look at what's going on and what's getting built, it's not happening fast enough or near the scale it needs to be. And the repercussions of that is that all of the buildings that are, all those cranes that we're seeing are building buildings that their elevator pits are not designed correctly, their elevations are wrong, and their mechanical equipment and their FP&L vaults are all in the wrong spot. That has huge implications for our communities in the future. And the sooner we grapple with that reality and change our codes, the better off we're going to be as communities. And it's really the only way I see of making it viable to continue to build along the coast in areas that where it's possible to build. We have to be building the right way. So what happened after Hurricane Andrew, again, to use that example, is we had a massive event that occurred. And so it galvanized action, and you didn't have to make the argument because you could see the damage, you could see the human impact. We don't have that as one event, but we have had it as a series of events. And every time that we do, we have to go back. Those building committees at the state level that are working on changing the code, I know right now they're adding an appendix that's going to be voluntary. And that's the first step. You start with a voluntary system, you give people pathways to doing the right thing. But over time, it needs to become the code. And you need to kind of have that as a goal, because if you just leave it as a voluntary system, everybody gets a gold star when they do the right thing, but it costs more money. I hate to tell everybody, but it's not going to happen. So eventually you start with education. You explained a big part of this is also educating engineers and architects as to why this matters. I believe our continuing education should make it mandatory to understand how to design resilient buildings. Start with that, because our engineers don't even understand it. They'll often tell you that what they're doing is already resilient, but it's not. And so if we don't educate our own community of architects and engineers, and then have them go back and start to advocate and lobby to change the codes, there isn't going to be this lead for resilient buildings. It's too neighborhood specific. You guys have been working with Miami Beach is a great example of a city that's taking the information and the data, changing their codes. And I don't have to argue with my clients. You know why? Because it's in the code. I have freeboard. I have 5 feet of extra feet to build my height. It's required that I build and I contain my water on my site. It's required that I have to do all of these things that are just good practice. It makes it so much easier for all of us. And it makes our cities and our communities able to get better bond ratings, which then lowers the insurance costs for everybody that's in that city. So it's a win-win, but people have to be educated from the developers. So I would say to architects, serve on boards and educate your fellow developers. I did with the University of Miami. I was on that board for 4 years. It wasn't an architecture board. It was a real estate board. Why? Because architects need to be in the spaces and rooms where our clients are and make the case. And then amongst ourselves, architects and engineers need to educate themselves. And companies that are partners to us, really, there should be a very rigorous continuing education component, not just focused on wind zones. I mean, that I have to take a structural wind component. It's a requirement of my license. And I believe it's time to make rising water and sea level rise and sustainability a requirement of your license. It's that critical.